Hey, Diana. Tommy here, the professor of the course. So glad you made it in and looking forward to having you in the conversation. And I was thrilled to learn from your intro video that you're headed into the chaplaincy program, etc. So, yeah, this is great. Uh, Love your responses in both forums in week one. As an auditor, you're not obligated, at least in my mind, to do these, but I'm of course thrilled for you to do them because I think you're going to get a lot more out of whatever you hear from the course. And you're coming back again and again, wisely, I think, to the question of the audience of the letter. And you may have already seen my intro video for week two, but I deal with this pretty extensively because I know that it's about this point after week one where we're starting to maybe think more carefully about that. And my own sense is that, first of all, you're right that the community in Rome is composed of Jews and non-Jews. That seems undeniable for a whole variety of reasons, one of which is the greetings that Paul sends at the end in chapter 16. But in terms of the audience of the letter, who Paul wants to be heard to address the most directly, I think that he does characterize the audience as people of Gentile background. And I give a little bit of an explanation of that in the um, intro video, as I say. But maybe that gives you a way of holding together the, I think, sound judgment that you've made about the presence of Jewish and Gentile people in the community in Rome, but still to take seriously how Paul characterizes the audience, namely as of Gentile background. Um, I think that the tendency in the Christian reception of the letter is to imagine that the primary conflict, socially speaking, that Paul is addressing in the letter is between Jews and non-Jews. And that I think is wrong myself, because it seems to me to be clear that um, the conflict is instead between um, some non-Jews and other non-Jews uh, who are struggling with um, kind of ways of bringing a diversity of commitments and convictions, various kinds of exposure to the Jewish tradition, various ways of understanding the law, all to the same table. Um, in chapters 9 to 11, Paul makes it explicit. That's where he says, I'm speaking to you as Gentiles insofar as I am apostle to the Gentiles, but he's warning them as non-Jews about disowning not Jewish members of the community immediately that they're a part of in Rome, but Jews of the wider kind of people of God that are relatives of Paul's, he says, and hostile to the audience of the letter. And the temptation of the audience, as we'll see there, is to disown those hostile Jewish relatives of Paul and to pretend that they have effectively replaced them, you might say, in the tree of Israel's life. And Paul argues against that. Um, Still, though, that conflict, I would say, is not sort of within the audience per se, but is something the audience is experiencing vis-a-vis um, Jewish people who are not a part of the sort of Christian gatherings, probably as a regular basis, but as we see in Acts, variously opposed to the Jesus movement. We know from Acts and other sources that the gospel proved to divide the Jewish community itself. And it's hard even to turn that into a nice, clean division. There's, as you might imagine, a whole spectrum of Jewish responses to the Jesus movement. And we want to sort of try to be patient with that diversity on the ground rather than kind of pigeonholing the people that are variously in view in the letter into neat categories that are probably not justified. Anyway, so that is a little elaboration there on the audience. I agree with you. Obviously, if you heard my podcast on the relevance of the broader context of Habakkuk, as opposed to thinking Paul is just kind of lifting one fragment out of the book, which I don't think would be consistent with the way Jews like Paul understood and used the law and the prophets. But I think there's even evidence just in terms of how the letter unfolds that more of the context of Habakkuk is at work, that the meaning of the words of what later tradition, Christian tradition, in fact, in the 13th century identified with chapter and verse as 2:4. That would not have been, a numerical distinction in Paul's day at all. But arguably, the meaning of those words is part of the fabric of the book. So that said, in that context, I think we can see that, as you rightly emphasize, faith is presented in contrast to the ways of the arrogant, the proud, the puffed up, which characterizes the oppressors of Israel that Habakkuk is complaining to God about, outraged that God would allow such cruelty to befall God's own people. And the word of the Lord that comes to Habakkuk and then through the prophet to the people is that while it's tempting to cave to these ways of cynicism and exploitation of the vulnerable and the weak in the face of such immense difficulties, the just will live by faith. Namely, or more specifically, they will live by trusting in God to provide for their life, to trust God enough to continue loving God and loving neighbor as the law commands in the face of such dire circumstances that people could grow jaded and simply give up and resort to a kind of dog eat dog way of living. So that is the kind of significance that faith is given in terms of how it's used there in Habakkuk. And two things I want to say about that. First, I think it's clear in the context that the faith of the just is dependent on the faith of God. The just can trust God, that God will act in good faith according to God's promises, according to God's self-disclosure, who God has been. That's the basis of the faith of the just. And so the faith of the just human, God's sort of covenant partner, is itself the fruit of God's own faith or faithfulness. And I think that's what Paul means when he says that the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith, from the faith of God to the faith of the human, that is the fruit of God's faith or faithfulness. And that is, then what prompts Paul to appeal to Habakkuk as the warrant for that claim of how the justice of God is revealed. And I am open to a kind of messianic horizon, you might say, of all of the law and the prophets. And that, I think, is implicit in the way New Testament writers understand the words of Scripture to be alive, pregnant, you might say, with a future that unfolds depending on how those words grow with the movement of the people over generations. And because of that, I would say it is right to see that the faith of God and the faith of the human reach their fullness in the figure of the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one person. And that life of Jesus as the Messiah has been spilling out by the Spirit to people like the audience of Romans, non-Jews who are coming to the obedience of faith by the power of this Spirit of resurrection that has touched them and gathered them and sort of called upon them to follow Jesus as Lord, as opposed to the other gods and lords that are on offer to them in Rome. So that's the first thing I was going to highlight about that. But the second thing is I think especially pertinent given how you have tried to make sense of Habakkuk. And you'll notice, and what it is that in the next segment of the argument, which we're going to be studying here in week 2, you'll see that faith is the alternative to a boastful judgment, a boastful way of ruling over others. And so I think that you can see the theme of what faith is in Habakkuk then carried through in what Paul writes from 1:18 to the end of chapter 2, really to the end of chapter 3, and going into the Abraham part of the argument in chapter 4. And that is that the life that God has given by the Spirit, resurrection power, the life that the just come to experience, is a life that comes as a gift. It comes by trusting God to provide what human beings cannot engineer or control, but can promote by the way that they live in faith. And that's the alternative again, right? Faith is the alternative to an arrogant, judgmental way of trying to govern or shape a community's life. So that's kind of how that is going to play out. I hope that's helpful to you. Again, welcome to the course. Great to have you. And I'm thrilled that you're in the area and we'll be able to connect in person, it sounds like, this Friday. So looking forward to seeing you then.